Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has recently come out and said Australian super is an extraordinary national asset. That statement has ruffled a few feathers, to say the least, with many accusing Albo of trying to steal their super. Many Aussies have shared their views online and around the family dinner table. My mother-in-law had an absolute crack. And to be fair, this is kind of a big deal. Australia has about $4.5 trillion in superannuation. That's your retirement money. And no matter which way you cut it, that's not a small amount of cash. Meanwhile, at the same time, Liberal Senator Andrew Bragg called the superannuation system one of the biggest public policy failures since Federation. Same system, yet two completely different views on what your super is actually for. But here's the part that makes this story interesting. Whilst politicians argue about whether super should be doing more for Australia, superannuation funds have already moved roughly half of all super funds overseas. And once you understand why, this entire debate starts to look very different. So today we're cutting through all the noise. We're going to understand why your super is the latest political battleground and why all this could have an enormous effect on your future. Let's get into it. Firstly, we need to understand just how enormous the Australian super system has become. We're talking roughly $4.5 trillion. That's not just a retirement system anymore. That's one of the largest pools of investment capital in the world. And in July 2026, Albanese was speaking at Superannuation's leading roundtable. In the room were some of Australia's biggest banks and super funds. And it was this statement that got people talking. A national asset that can be used more appropriately and get better returns as well, not just for individuals and retirees, but for the nation. That last part is what matters. Not just for retirees and individuals, but for the nation. And Albanese reportedly encouraged super funds to invest more heavily into Australia. Now look, on the face of it, this seems pretty straightforward. Australia needs an enormous amount of capital to fund various projects: housing, infrastructure, energy, and general Australian businesses. And sitting inside Australian super funds is trillions of dollars looking for long-term investment homes. So why couldn't that money be used to generate returns for Australians whilst also helping build Australia? On paper, it sounds like a win-win. But there is a problem. The pushback came from within the room itself. Westpac CEO Anthony Miller reportedly said, "Don't touch the super complex, don't direct it, don't tell it where to go." I mean, you can't really be more direct than that, can you? But this does highlight the fundamental issue. Your super fund doesn't exist as an economic development agency. It exists to deliver retirement benefits to its members. The concern isn't necessarily that investing in Australian infrastructure or businesses is a bad idea. Some of those investments could actually be fantastic. The issue is when the government starts influencing those investment decisions and the overall investment starts to not be the only reason an investment is chosen. Because sometimes these two objectives can align. A project might be great for Australia and a great investment for your super fund, but they won't always align. And when they don't align, which one wins? That's the uncomfortable question sitting underneath this entire debate. And strangely enough, the other side of politics has almost the complete opposite concern. Liberal Senator Andrew Bragg has recently been attacking compulsory super from a completely different direction. Recently, at the National Press Club, he called it the biggest public policy failure since Federation. There might be a little bit of mayo on that one, Andrew. A system that has stolen choice and agency from Australians. His basic argument is something like this. Why should you be forced by the government to put 12% of your money into a system where you cannot touch the money for decades? Basically, why shouldn't you have more control? Now, I just want to point out a quick distinction here. As of filming right now in August 26, this is not official Liberal policy. Opposition leader Angus Taylor has said that Andrew Bragg's comments are his own personal views. And Deputy Leader Jane Hume was on record as saying that the super guarantee is here to stay. So when you hear claims that the coalition wants to abolish compulsory superannuation, that's not currently coalition policy. There are certainly members of the coalition who are sceptical of parts of the system, but that's very different to having an actual policy to remove compulsory super. And that distinction does matter. Forget the political point scoring for a second, because underneath this issue is a genuinely interesting philosophical divide. On one side, you see this enormous pool of capital that could potentially serve members and Australia at the same time. Yet on the other side, you have Australians arguing that they should have more control over how their retirements are invested. And we've already seen versions of that idea. In 2025, the coalition proposed that first home buyers could withdraw up to $50,000 from their superannuation fund to help buy their first home. One direction gives the Australian super pool potentially a bigger role to play in this country's future. The other direction gives greater freedom for individuals to choose how and when their super money is used. But while politicians argue over what direction the money should move, the money has been moving, and it's heading in a completely different direction entirely. And this is the part of the story that I think's quite interesting, because half of Australia's superannuation's assets are already invested offshore. And roughly 60% of that offshore exposure is in the United States. Think about the contradiction here. Australia is debating whether or not we should be investing more money at home, and super funds are actively choosing to invest more money abroad. Why? The answer is actually pretty straightforward. Opportunity and diversification. I mean, if you have a quick look at the ASX, you'll see exactly what I mean. Now, don't get me wrong, the ASX has some great companies, but it's heavily concentrated into areas like banks, mining, and resources. Now, if you compare that to the global markets, things like technology make up roughly 20%. On the ASX, it only makes up about 5%. And if you think about some of the businesses that have really driven the world economy in the last couple of decades, Microsoft, Apple, Nvidia, Meta, Tesla, you just can't get that same exposure investing in Australia alone. And the super funds understand this. They're managing retirement savings across decades. They want access to industries, economies, and companies that are not available in Australia at the scale they require to invest the kind of capital they have access to. They kind of have no choice but to go global. And recent market performance only reinforces this. These are market snapshots. They're not a reason to chase what's performed well in the last 12 months. They just simply illustrate a point. If Australian super funds are to invest more domestically, the investments need to stack up against global competition. Because at the end of the day, we're ultimately talking about people's retirements. Sometimes investing locally will generate strong returns and will go perfectly together. But if they don't, what should win? The national priority or the member's retirement? That's why the phrase national asset has generated such a reaction. And this is the part where I think this entire debate gets completely misunderstood. Someone in Canberra calling your super a national asset doesn't mean all of a sudden Canberra owns your super. No one in Canberra is about to empty your account. The debate's just about the future direction of a system, because when Australia's super system was first set up, no one was talking about a pool of money this enormous. Today we're talking about trillions of dollars. And at that size, it doesn't just affect retirees. It affects financial markets, infrastructure, capital flows, and potentially government policy. Which means that as this pool of money only continues to grow, the conversations around what happens with this cash are only going to continue to get louder. But there is a subtle irony in watching politicians argue over who should have more influence over your superannuation. Because there is absolutely one person who should be paying more attention to your super. You. A huge amount of members' money has moved overseas without members ever consciously deciding, I want more exposure to America. Their investment options and funds made the decision for them. But you still have choice within the super system. You can choose what investment option your funds are in, how much you pay in fees, how much international versus Australian exposure you have, whether you're sitting in the default option that your fund placed you in years ago that you've never bothered to look at since. Now, I'm not telling you what option to pick. This isn't financial advice, do your own research. But if the politicians are arguing this intensely over trillions of dollars, maybe spend 10 minutes deciding where your piece of the pie goes. So when Albo calls superannuation a national asset, he's probably pointing out something that is undeniably true. The system has become so enormous that what happens to that money has a significant flow-on effect to the entire Australian economy. The real debate is what happens next. Should more of that money help build Australia? Should individuals have more control over it? Or should funds simply just keep investing where they think they can get the best returns for their members? Because while politicians are arguing over these questions, the money has already been voting with its feet, and it's increasingly voting to move overseas. The real question isn't who controls $4.5 trillion in Australian superannuation. It's whether or not you're paying attention to the part of it that's yours. If you enjoyed the video, hit like, consider subscribing, support the channel by clicking on the affiliate links down in the description below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.